Welcome to the Infosys Healthcare and Life Sciences Perspectives, the podcast and video interview series with thought leaders.
Welcome to the LinkedIn Live webcast. Being resilient, that's live enterprise. New opportunities and challenges in the pharma industry is going to be the topic we're going to talk about today. This is another edition of the Perspectives, our podcast and video interviews with thought leaders in the healthcare and the life sciences industry. I want to start by thanking all our viewers for joining us today. We live in unprecedented times, and hopefully all of you and your families are safe and healthy. I am Shubhra Malik. I am Senior Vice President and Global Head of Life Sciences at Infosys. Today, I have the pleasure of hosting Saurav Gupta, Chief Research Officer at HFS, on this session of Perspectives. Welcome, Saurav, to today's live webcast on Perspectives on LinkedIn Live.
Hey, thank you. Thank you, Shubhro. It gives me a chance to wear a formal shirt for a change.
Yes, don't we live in interesting times? We wear formal shirt on days when we do video cams and web chats like this. So thank you again for joining us. I think today's topic, being resilient is an apt topic. We live in times which I guess in our lifetime we would not have heard of. Possibly even in the stories that we would have heard growing up, we would not have heard of such an unprecedented situation. COVID-19 has obviously affected every aspect of our personal lives, of the industries, of businesses. And now specifically for life sciences as an industry, like any other industry, it has been a challenging time as we work with our clients. It is and interestingly enough, life sciences as a sector happens to be in the center of this crisis, just from a hope perspective. So, Saurav, what are your views on that?
I completely agree, Shubhro. I think we actually just completed a survey of over 600 different Global 2000 enterprises, and an overwhelming majority, 80% of them, said that this thing is bigger than the 2008 crisis. We are clearly headed into a recession. How deep that recession goes is clearly the trillion-dollar question right now. And yes, pharma is, the center of the universe right now. So they will not. It's super interesting times. It's challenging, but I also do have hope. That things come out for the better because recessions do end. And the companies that can adapt quickly are the ones who will come out probably even stronger.
No, that's very well said, Saurav. I think hope is the most important thing for us. And like you said, life sciences is the beacon of hope for us now. I am sure that we will come out of this, will come out stronger. But at the same time, at least our view of this crisis is it's something that possibly we would not have imagined, right? It's unreal. It's out of a movie. Like if you have seen Contagion, it's straight out of that movie. But from your perspective, what are the things that you think the life sciences industry at an overall level, like pharma and the medtech, will be challenged as you look into what has happened in the past, and as we look at going forward into the future?
Yeah, no, I think it is going to be an extremely challenging environment, and I think one of the things that we should not look at this as a crisis. Crises come and go, and crisis is for maybe a few weeks or a few months. This is going to stay with us in some form or fashion forever. I call it the new abnormal. And this is going to be the new abnormal that we need to adjust to and live in. And it goes the same for pharma. One of the things that we'll have to realize is, how do we change our work culture? How do you do R&D without wet labs? It's just a different way of doing business. So that's one. But I think there are some economic aspects to it as well. So look at supply chain, for example, for pharma, medtech, etc. Supply chains are not transparent in today's world. We still don't know how much of API exactly active pharmaceutical ingredients are coming from China. We know it's a big amount. but can we pinpoint exactly where all of these is coming from? And there's going to be huge disruptions in supply chain. Same goes with manufacturing. We've had stories of, suddenly factories have to become ventilator factories. We've had car manufacturers like Tesla creating ventilators. Um, there's also a huge reputational risk, I think, for the pharma companies, because as we were just discussing, they're at the center of the storm, and everybody's hope is on them, but they can't afford to screw up. Also, there's a huge reputational risk. There's also a rat race going on for antiviral drugs, vaccines, etc., etc. Uh, and I think there's a huge public scrutiny. Prices are increasing, and there's a socio-political impact that these companies will deal with for a long time. In terms of, it's going to be a very price-sensitive market, and both top line and bottom line are going to be impacted. And I my advice to a lot of our pharma clients is you've got to start looking at the world of profit with a purpose. It's important to look at profit. I think you need to be profitable, but I think it needs to come with the other P of purpose as well, as especially for the pharma industry.
No, and I think these are very valid points, right? If you look at how clinical trials are getting impacted, how this, like you said, the supply chain part of it. Can you really predict the supply chain? And most important, which we've talked about and we started this discussion, right? The fact that we are going to be in a depression or a recession kind of a situation. I don't want to use the word depression. Hopefully, we don't get there. It's more of a recession. There will be tremendous pressure on the healthcare industry broadly and life sciences. And like you said, profit with purpose becomes the most important thing. So if you look at today, the unemployment rates have shot up. People's ability to cover for the healthcare costs are going to go down. Maybe in FY or calendar year 21, we might actually see some of the healthcare costs being cut back because of the amount of spend that has already happened in the sector. So if you look at these, and if you talk a little bit more about the economic impact that we are going to see on the medtech and the pharma companies, and like you said, right, they're going to make ventilators, they're going to make test kits, but if you look at their routine business, right, which is manufacturing drugs for solving the most important problems of life, like in cancer or neurosciences kind of a thing. What are your views on some of the longer term impacts and the level of preparedness that you believe that the life sciences industries broadly have, right? Both pharma and biotech, and the med devices, if you take them together.
Yeah, I think I think there are few things. So first, I think the biggest thing is we live in a very uncertain environment, and uncertainty is probably kills everything. I don't know what's going to happen in the next 2 weeks. Leave aside the next 12 months, and that I think is a huge challenge for the pharma industry as well. Is what's going to happen, and you take the whole socio-political environment that's happening. Elections in November. Um, Two polar opposite visions of what the healthcare ecosystem should look like. There's a lot of uncertainty, and this whole COVID-19 pandemic shock has added to that uncertainty. So I think uncertainty is one of the biggest issues that we'll be dealing with, Shubhro, in my mind. I also think if you look at, some estimates suggest that $8 trillion or more have already been the cost of this pandemic, and I don't think it's the end of it. It's probably starting. You look at places like Brazil and some others where it's still exponentially rising. So, and we've already seen close to $8-9 trillion of cost impact already. So I think the recession is definitely going to be here. We should not sort of fool ourselves to not think that everything will be hunky dory in few months. Uh, and I think with a recession, I think consumer debts will rise, bankruptcies will increase, spending power will reduce, and that means that uh, affordability of drugs will become a challenge. How will people afford their prescription drugs? we've started to hear stories where a couple of a diabetes family is sharing one prescription. Uh, that's not normal, and how does that and that will have a tremendous amount of impact on the go-to-market strategy for pharma, medtech, going forward. I think we're going to see much more collaborative efforts going forward. I think right now we are in a hyper competitive world,
Yeah.
but we're already seeing some levels of collaboration already starting to happen. With uh, especially with getting the vaccines out there for this thing, we are seeing some of the big pharma companies trying to collaborate their efforts. So I think there's going to be a huge impact as we enter a economy decline, um, because of just pure simple economics of spending power, consumer debt, affordability, and unemployment. Who could have imagined 40 million people are unemployed, Shubhro, as of today, just in the US? Now, as that rises, that's if there's excessive supply, the prices are going to drop. So, what's the impact of cost of doing business is also something that we'll have to evaluate. So, I think there's going to be a long-term impact, and uh, companies who are able to come out of this will be perhaps even more successful. And I think that's the light at the end of the tunnel that we need to be looking at.
No, I think that's a very good perspective, Saurabh, and I agree. That ability of patients to pay for the increased cost of healthcare, like you said, this example of diabetes prescription being shared. These are all going to be realities that we will have to deal with. But if you look at it again from from a pharma perspective, I mean, they obviously have their own challenges. So, for example, whereas there is a race for the vaccines, and we need to build the vaccine. That's all great, but they actually have a fundamental issue of can they maintain the integrity of the supply chain. So if you look at it, FDA and WHO actually had announced that with the COVID-19 situation, that the supply chain is going to get disrupted. Where do you get the APIs from? Where are you going to get the generics from, etc. Right? So FDA had asked all the companies, I think about 180 companies, if I'm not mistaken, to go and look at their supply chain and evaluate it, because a lot of the drugs are manufactured in China, right? I mean, China is usually an integral part of the supply chain. And having said that, it's just not China, right? If you look at, even if you happen to have a plant in Italy as an example, or even in US, people can't get into those plants anymore. How do you keep the manufacturing plants running? How do you make sure that the supply chain can survive an impact like this, right? And so the resilience, the topic that we had today, the resilience of the supply chain is obviously in question. It's great to see, by the way, that regulators like the FDA and the governments are stepping in to possibly support them, more than just saying that, finding faults with them, that saying, okay, why is it all wrong? But coming with a more supportive attitude and saying that, can we help you to make sure that your supply chain is going to be resilient? We will not have a different kind of a crisis where we run out of drugs. Forget about just the pandemic of COVID-19. You might actually start seeing a different problem where people don't have access to necessary drug. Like, let's say,
Right.
What if Tylenol goes off market today? You can't make anymore. Or if the diabetes drug that we need is not available for patients who need it. So I think the resilience of the supply chain has become very important for them, just from a human strategic perspective. But again, at the same time, if you look at the past view of the supply chain, we have never imagined a situation where we would, let's say, stress test the supply chain to this level.
Yeah.
So actually, in the past, the pharma industry, the medtech companies have implemented various types of track and trace, supply chain visibility solutions, right, and supply chain visibility initiatives. But at the same time, possibly in today's world, it has become imperative that gets completely redefined. And maybe our view is that they need a much more flexible, much more agile supply chain, and much more transparency in the supply chain, right down to the last API, for them to react to the pandemic kind of situation, right? Because if you think about it, today we are dealing with COVID-19. Who knows what's coming next? The next time we hear anything even close enough like a COVID-22, just to make it up, hopefully we don't see that. the first thing is going to be this reaction that we have seen. This has become the, let's say, the SOP of how to react to pandemic. That first thing is shut everything down. So I guess in the near future, not only is this going to be the new way of working on pandemic or any response to any future threat of this nature, so it will become imperative that the supply chain is much more resilient, and people will have to put in, and the company is more important, will have to put in certain processes, technologies in place to make this happen. So again, what do you see from your perspective?
Look, I couldn't agree more, Shubhro, with you. I think the the pharma supply chains are very, very complicated beasts. Not just you look at manufacturing of APIs also has a supply chain itself. So look at that end-to-end supply chain from API to the manufacturing plant to distribution to pharmacy retailer to the end consumer. It's a hugely complicated supply chain, and we honestly, it's in a dire need for a fill in the blank solution because we don't have that much transparency. We broadly understand, this is where my APIs are coming from. It's coming from China or India or whatever. Uh, this is where my manufacturing plant is. And then you need cold storage for some of the, you need cold supply chains for some of the, more sophisticated drugs. Uh, you need stocking visibility in retailers, and then finally getting into the hands of the consumers. And it's not only the developed world. This is one industry which supplies to the entire globe, the most impoverished nations and people. uh, we need to figure out supply chains for that. And I think traceability, track and trace, provenance, some of those things have been lacking. And this has exposed, this pandemic has exposed that. Uh, you know, uh, it, but I think the good news, Shubhro, is that it's not that we don't have solutions for it. We've perhaps not had the willingness or the mindset. Perhaps we've not had a burning platform, uh, to implement those solutions. But we have solutions. Look at something like what FDA is doing with food services. They're implementing a huge end-to-end blockchain from farm to consumer. If you can do it for lettuce, you can do it for some drug also, I'm assuming. So it's not like we don't have solutions. It's just that, do we have the willingness and do we have the appetite to bring together this ecosystem uh, uh, together? And I think everybody has a role to play. Shubhro, the government has a role to play. The pharma companies have a role to play in it. But I couldn't agree more. This has completely shown up uh, despite all the advancements. I'm not saying that people have been sleeping in terms of their supply chain flexibility and resilience, but still we're not at the stage where we could deal with such a thing if it comes again, God forbid.
I think that's a fair point, Saurabh. So I think before we segue again into the next part of our conversation, into diving a little bit deeper and looking at the solutions of what we can do, what are the offerings we have, let's take a pause here and see if there are any questions from the audience who might have joined this session.
Sure.
Okay, so we need to wait for technology to work. Okay, so here is an interesting question. So the question seems to be, what are the, apart from COVID-19, what are the factors that are playing a key role in transforming the life sciences landscape, right? That's a good one. So, I'll just take a stab at it, and we talked a little bit about the changes that are happening, but let me just see if I'll take a first pass at it, and then you can add your color commentary. So it's a good question. So if I look at it from a factors, we talked about the supply chain, which is obviously something that needs to be looked at. But more fundamentally also, one of the areas that are getting impacted is the clinical trials, the core R&D part of the business, right? So if you think of it today, running a clinical trial has become a challenge. How do you get patients into the physician's office or the hospitals or the labs? That's not possible anymore. Physicians themselves are not coming to offices. So we have seen that some of the clinical trials have been paused, which obviously has a much more long-term impact on the pharma and the medtech industry. And then they will have to figure out how they're going to manage it. So what we are going to see is how we can adopt the new paradigms to this new paradigm of people not being able to come into for the clinical trials and yet be able to do the clinical trials. So if I look at it, broadly speaking, supply chain and the ability to do clinical trials, both the supply side and the innovation side are broadly impacted just because of this, what we see with COVID-19. Sort of your views on this.
No, I agree. I think even before COVID-19, Shubhro, the pharma industry was under tremendous pressure. It's not like it was a rosy scenario. You look at, I think last year itself, the M&A value for in the pharma industry was like $360 billion, if I'm not mistaken. You know, that's like phenomenal. I don't think in my 20 years I've probably there was one more year where we reached that level. So that which which means there was already a significant pressure on R&D. You know, most of these $360 billion or close to that kind of acquisition was largely, acquiring each other's pipelines, uh, uh, and which the R&D returns. We all know how much time and money and effort goes into the whole R&D process, and the chances for success are minuscule. And that has been thrown into a tizzy right now. A lot of drugs that were close to approval are uh, delayed. And imagine the cash flow issues that will bring to some of the smaller companies who were having a good run, in fact, coming up with some great innovative products. Will be interesting. And then the political environment, man. I think that's going to be super interesting as we go through it. I think it's uh, pretty much everybody has made the pharma industry, the super villain of our economy. Uh, and how the industry reacts to that, what tone it takes, is going to be very important as well in my mind. So I think there's a ton of uh, issues, bottom line, top line, emotion. There's lots going on.
Okay, I mean, that's great. I think there's one more question that's come up, how the future will look like for the pharma industry. That's I would say, $1 trillion question. Whoever has asked this question, my friend, I mean, I wish we had the crystal ball to tell you, but just my 2 cents on it. I would think that the pharma industry, as we see it today, will completely change. Not in terms so much about the medicine it provides, or not in terms so much about what are the focus areas for them. I think the current thing on vaccine on COVID-19 is a humanitarian crisis, which is here and now. But beyond that, the focus will continue. What we might end up seeing, in my opinion, is that some of the regulatory changes that will come in, right? I think FDA, EMEA, and all the government agencies will get together and try to see how they can maybe make changes which have not changed for a long time, make fundamental changes in regulations, so that it allows for much faster time to market for the pharma companies. At the same time, potentially, the pharma organizations will get much more closer to the physicians and patients with all the digital technologies that are going to be enabling their business processes. So there is a very high likelihood that, going back to the point sort of you were making about profit with purpose, maybe they will have to adopt new ways of working so that they can find more efficiencies in the way they find drugs, so that they can pass on the benefits in the future in a way that it doesn't hurt their own business, back to the patients, and make themselves not the villains. I think they have an interesting thing, right? They were villains in the past, but now they are the heroes. I'm sure they are. because they can actually help us save, and it will continue. I think this is a great shift for the pharma industry, because the positioning can completely change, and that might also help them in the longer term as they look for go out of this pandemic situation.
Yeah, no, I agree, Shubhro. I think consumer centricity is going to be the driving force for the future of the pharma, medtech, healthcare industry in general. Um, and I think what I wish for, honestly, is that the ecosystem is really complex. You have life sciences, you have medtech, you have pharmacies, you have the government playing a huge role, then you have the payers and the providers and the insurers and all that. And unfortunately, if you look at them, all their incentives are misaligned. They're not the one potential thing that everybody hopefully can agree on is that consumer is the king, or queen. That it has to be patient centric, it has to be consumer centric, and I hope if the industry can coalesce around that notion. We at HFS call it the hyper-connected future state, wherein we believe that these ecosystems should be created where we start to look at cross-industry collaboration, because that's where consumer experience can be driven. Uh, I think if we keep running in our own silos, we won't see fundamental change. Um, Now, whether that happens in the future or not, I don't know. But I hope and wish and pray for that kind of a future state.
No, I mean, I think that's a great point, right, Saurabh? And because as we look into the future, that's a great question, right? And for us to be talking about, you're right. The hyper-connected future, hyper-connected industries is possible in the future. So if you look at the topic for our discussion, we talked about resilient enterprise, but we're also talking about a live enterprise. I mean, if you look at Infosys, we believe that if you treat an enterprise as a living, breathing organization, it should be able to sense and react on a live basis to any stimulus that is internal or external to the organization, and that can only happen maybe if you're interconnected, if you're hyper connected to the ecosystem. So, as an example today, and that's a good segue into our conversation for going forward now. The discussions on the deeper into the pharma industry, if you look at it, we talked about clinical trials, right? I mean, just to remain on that point. That has a huge long-term impact on the pharma industry, right? And if they don't have, and today, if you think of it, the solutions that are staring in front of the industry are not very good. I mean, that is possibly one part of the ecosystem where, because of the protocols, because of the regulatory needs, we haven't seen a massive adoption of technology, right? I mean, today we see companies like Science 37 or Verily Life Sciences coming up with technologies which can help people run the clinical trials in a much more efficient way, and which basically means how do you run it virtually, right? Where you're not actually engaging the patient to come to a center, and that's where all the fallouts happen. Secondly, how can we monitor, or how do we leverage these toys that we have? I use toys more broadly, like the watch, the phones that we have, which can interconnect you, make you live, make the trials live. How do we make the trials live, right? Reading, sensing, where tomorrow, if there is a lockdown in, let's say, in Pune in India or in Minnesota in US because of this pandemic, and tomorrow because of some other crisis, the clinical trials can still continue. It doesn't need to stop. It doesn't need to wait. There are technologies, and for that, like you said, the ecosystem needs to come together. It's just not about the pharma companies trying to do them. We have a role to play potentially as a technology provider. I am sure the regulators have a role to play, and they are actually allowing, right? They are actually allowing for certain regulations to be opened up. They will have to look at it seriously. Then you have to have the payers come into the picture, the providers come into the picture. So it is going to bring, in our opinion, just remaining on clinical trials as an example, which is the core of the business. Actually, if the clinical trials stop, you won't see an immediate impact on the top line of the pharma company, but you can be rest assured that their P&L and their top line is going to be impacted 2 years down the road or 5 years down the road, because one drug launch will stop, and that will throw the complete projections of the company off the radar. So what again, and again, your views on some of the impacts that you think more broadly coming again to the pharma industry.
Yeah, look, Shubhro, I think despite all these toys being available to us, like you mentioned, uh, a lot of these so-called digital transformation initiatives at pharma companies were still tottering at the edges. You know, we've been talking about digital transformation not for the last 1 or 2 years, but maybe for the entire. I think the 2010s were all about digital transformation, right? Nobody else talked about anything else but digital. Yeah, but who has digitally transformed uh, is the question, and I think this there is we were in a wait for digital kind of a mindset. We were finding excuses, uh, but I think this situation, this COVID-19 pandemic, will probably put us into a straight to digital kind of a mindset. Let's move forward with some of these things. Yes, I understand cash will be an issue for maybe 3, maybe 6 months, uh, and but at some point of time, we'll have to pull the trigger. In fact, in the survey that I was mentioning, where we reached out to 600 odd enterprises in the global 2000, uh, there are 4 or 5 technologies that we are seeing will actually increase uh, spending after this pandemic. Cybersecurity is one, especially as we transition to either a work from home or virtual clinical trials and what have you. I think they've got to be secure.
Yes.
So cybersecurity is, it's got to become a CEO mandate, not just a mid-level sort of a thing that we do. Uh, Cloud migration, cloud is another huge area. Now, I think it's finally time to hopefully stop having that debate on-premise versus cloud. Let's just move to the cloud. It's cheaper. It works. It's scalable. And we are seeing a lot of traction. The likes of Google, Amazon, Microsoft, all of them are reporting some strong traction around cloud. And I think the AAA trifecta of automation, analytics, and AI. I think those 3 technologies. Um, um, you look at what Google is doing with sort of using artificial intelligence and computer vision to look at cancer scans and sort of predict that. I think these are the 4 or 5 technologies that we think are gonna have a significant um, uptick in the pharma industry in 3 to 6 months time, because we've got to move straight to digital. Otherwise it'll be very hard to survive.
No, and that's a very insightful observation by you, Saurabh, right? If I look at the pharma industry and the medical devices both, right? The what we have always observed is that IT, more importantly, was seen as a cost, right?
Yeah.
The ability to invest, the ability to bring in the new technologies. I think the current CIOs possibly couldn't agree more that they have been kind of held back in shackles, right? They've been shackled to saying, can you cut cost? Can you cut cost? Can you cut cost? But with some of these changes that you talked about, in the clinical trial or the supply chain visibilities that need to be created, we obviously see the entire CIO organization, and more importantly, now with the emergence moving to become a CDO kind of an organization, right? Where you will see that the CDO has become much more powerful. The CIO is becoming much more of a boardroom conversation, where the CDOs and CIOs will help, do some of this digital transformation that's coming up, right? And once this digital transformation happens, then they can invest and go straight to digital and not have to wait for, again, okay, can we do this? Can we not do this? So it'll be important. It'll be interesting that as you talk about, let us say, the virtual clinical trials or the supply chain, digital technologies will be the way to go forward. Like you talked about blockchain as being one of the blockchain could be one of the things that we are looking at. But then, there could be other possibilities. So I just see that there are two questions which have come up, and maybe it's interesting. I see two questions which have come up, and we can possibly try and answer them together. Is like, I think one of the viewers have asked, what do we need to build an effective and resilient pharma supply chain? And going forward, what are the immediate steps needed to create a future-ready supply chain capabilities, right? I'm building off what I was just saying. I think the implementation of the technologies to, first of all, be live, right? If you have a live supply chain, just like you have a live enterprise, that is the need of the hour. Can you really predict that? Can you know exactly where your stockouts are going to be happen? Bringing in technology, whether it's blockchain or whichever technology you pick, but that's going to be there. And to be future ready, the first thing you need to know is where is your supply chain? Do you have complete visibility? Do you have alternatives and alternative approaches and approaches that you have, or alternative plans you have to move your supply chain flexibly from one to the other, right? If China shuts down, can you really at least keep some of the most important drugs available from some other manufacturing facility? That could be one way to look at it. Or do you want to create a digital version, like almost a digital twin of your entire supply chain, and then you can replicate it almost like an Iron Man movie and say what happens when you move things around? And maybe in some of this, you will see things like 3D printing and 3D manufacturing of drugs becoming more prevalent. I mean, that could be the future. Maybe your views again on this.
I think you summed it up really well, Shubhro. I couldn't agree more that, in my mind, I think there are two or three success factors, if we were to boil this down. One is, I think we need to broaden our definition of supply chain. It needs to be from, source to the consumer. Don't just look at your, organization don't just look at your supplier network and your distribution channel. But I think you need to broaden the horizon of supply chain, because I think where the failure points are today is when one organization hands over to the other organization. And we don't have visibility on that. People have done enough to make sure their own organization is somewhat resilient, but when there are handoffs, that's when the supply chains break. So I think how we can broaden that definition into call it the ecosystem supply chain or an industry supply chain or whatever, that semantics, but how do we make it really end to end for the industry? I think that's one. And I think we'll have to become more transparent. I think we still are not transparent enough, Shubhro, in our supply chains. We have broad understanding of where the materials and services are flowing, but we don't have granular visibility into it. And we cannot do effective supply chain planning without having that end-to-end map, and without being a little more granular and having real-time visibility. And again, it's not like we don't have the toys, to keep using your analogy. But those to me feel like the success factors for the a future and a resilient supply chain in the pharma industry.
No, I agree. I mean, the toys need to grow up. They have to become big boy.
Sure.
And I think, see, the interesting part is, right, these big boy toys are already, these toys have already become graduated a lot more. If you look at, I would say, some of the more advanced industries you talked about, if we can track a lettuce being grown in some distant farm, maybe in Africa, why can't we track where the API is coming from? Which is much more defined. It's actually a much more easier thing because it's in a plant, it's happening. And I see that, I think this supply chain topic seems to be pretty interesting with the audience, because I see one more question has come up and I'll just read it out. So can AI and ML help rebuild the supply chain? What are the other areas where AI and ML can be leveraged to tackle the crisis? Look, on AI and ML, and more broadly, maybe analytics and insights, if you kind of combine, and automation maybe. These are all buzzwords. At the end of the day, can AI and ML help? The answer might be yes. See, for AI has been a much used word in all our industries, and I'm sure if it is being used a lot in pharma as a whole. But the problem is that we have not adapted it to scale. Maybe the business cases didn't exist. But if you ask my answer, quite frankly, I believe the ability to react as a live enterprise or a live supply chain is essentially AI and ML is going to be core to that. We are not there as yet. I don't think the technology is there to make predictive analytic, predictive decision making, and cognitive, more importantly, is not yet there. But it has to evolve very rapidly, because if in the future uh, you cannot react immediately to certain situations on a real-time basis without a human intervention in some cases, maybe you will be delayed in your response. Now, obviously, the pharma supply chain possibly is not that real-time, but in some instances, maybe there
Sure.
is a need to be. And then, broadly speaking, the second part of the question, right, in terms of whether AI and ML can help the crisis, I don't know whether it can help the crisis. I mean, I see the crisis as a way to make a change and accelerate the change. It was always waiting. In my mind, AI and ML, and more importantly, the ability to look at data, create insights, create actionable insights, and some of those insights can be actioned either through machines or by human being intervention. That has to become much faster. Now, how do you, for example, react to not only a supply chain problem, but how can you make a trial more efficient? How can you react better to a patient need, right? Because now the patients will have to become will come much more in the center of the discussion. How do you react to the providers? How do you react to the physicians? All of it, if you just bring it all up together, can be done in the paradigm, in the context where AI and ML and data and insights are much more pervasively used, right?
Yeah.
So,
No.
value.
Yeah. No. Look. I think I'll pick up on one of the things that you said, Shubhro, was that we've not scaled this thing up. Every pharma company is using some form of artificial intelligence in some nook and corner of its, global operations. Somebody's doing it there, somebody's doing it in, certain part, etc. But our research suggests that less than 10% of these AI, initiatives uh, are actually scaled up. And I think there's going to be a POC fatigue that's going to come in. How many can you do? I call these things white elephants. They're beautiful, but they're completely useless. Because what do you do with that? At some point of time, these white elephants are going to transition into something real, and that will not happen till we scale it up. So to answer that question, are there use cases in supply chain? Are there use cases to tackle the crisis? The answer is absolutely yes. Fundamentally, I don't think anybody would disagree to that. That AI, ML, automation, analytics, they can have a significant impact. The question is, how do you get there? Um, we talk about data lakes. We live in data swamps. We like data quality is just atrocious. We don't have the talent to use these technologies. Uh, you know, Data scientists are just rare to find in today's world. So we don't have that. That's to me the challenge. The I don't think there is a doubt that AI ML will not have an impact. The answer is absolutely yes. But I think, how do you get to the promised land? How do you make it scaled up for it to give it a fighting chance to have an impact? I think that's the question that we need to really focus on.
I think great point, sort of exactly the data swamp. How do you get out of this data swamp, make sense of the data? And I think there's one more question here. Let's take that up. We're going to take this up as a last question so that we can wrap it up in the next, I think, 5-10 minutes that we have. So again, thanks for the question. So can telemedicine and telehealth be the new normal? Well, I would say yes, it is the new normal today. If you, at least the telehealth and telehealth part of it for sure, because if you can't meet your physicians today, it's a new normal. It seems amazing that at least for something which is more run of the mill, something which is not as complicated, we are able to quickly talk to the doctor, use the same video chat that we are using, and the doctor is able to prescribe the medicine and you can go take it. Who knows, in the future, your Apple Watch might have some sensors on it, and you can actually at least get some of the basic readings like the blood pressure and your temperature, everything sent to your physician. But that's the future. We're not there. But is it going to be the new normal? Yes. And goes back to the point that you were making earlier, right, Saurabh? That there is such a gigantic increase in healthcare costs. These are the ways by which you can actually reduce the healthcare costs, right? I mean, we have Teladoc and all these services, which actually, if I use it, it costs me less. So I think this telemedicine and telehealth are here to stay. They will be the ways in which you can cut costs. Also, also a great way for each one of us as patients to get access to the best doctors in the world. Tomorrow, I can actually, if I have all my reports ready and everything ready, I can talk to the best neuroscientist or a neurosurgeon or a neurophysician, in any part of the world, be the person maybe in Japan or could be in Australia or in India. I can talk to that person and get help and get prescription if possible, talking to them. So yes, in my opinion, it is here to stay. Saurabh, your views and how you feel about it?
Yeah, no, it is. It is going to be there. I feel it's going to be a hybrid model. I think if you look at telehealth, for example, it's less than 1% or some very minuscule part of the healthcare. I don't think it'll become suddenly 100%, in whatever 6-12 months. But I think it'll become, 15-20% of the new way of delivering healthcare services. And that's going to be the new reality. If you have a flu or if you're just suffering for cold, you really need to go to your physician. It's neither is it efficient for the patient, nor is it for the doctor, the physician. But if you have, let's say, an ear infection, for example, then you've got to go to the doctor, right? How do you do it over the phone? So I think it's going to be that hybrid model, and I think that's the new normal that we are. Leave aside telehealth. Look at work from home. We were culturally so resistant to work from home, like 2 months back, and now there's no resistance to it. Where did it all go? We're still being somewhat productive. There are our cats and dogs and children who come in, but besides that, we are still doing some work. And I think telehealth is somewhat of a similar phenomena. Will physical clinics cease to exist? I don't think so. There's a requirement for that. But I think there'll be a bigger proportion of telehealth for sure going forward.
Yeah, and I agree. I mean, this interview itself, the discussion that we're having today, this itself is unimaginable in the past, right? Maybe we would actually meet somewhere and do it in a studio, and here it goes. We do it on our laptop, and it works. And quite frankly, in the work from home environment, I think all of us have become more productive because you're traveling less, you're focused on the work you need to do. I see the other side of it now, a little bit of blurring between your personal and official life, but that's great. Yeah. So I think as we had a lot of good conversation here, right, about the impact of the overall COVID-19 situation on the industry, how it has impacted, let's say, the supply chain, how it has impacted clinical trials, the impact on M&A that might happen, cash flows, etc. We answered a few questions around AI, ML, on supply chain, and then we talked about how technology in itself might become more front and center of this discussion, right? And we also talked a little bit about the fact that technology will become much more widely adopted in the pharma sector, right? And how the new heroes on the block, which is the pharma industries, can continue to rise and shine and be the beacon of hope, be the beacon of transformation more broadly in the whole big scheme of humanity. But at the same time, we also talked about how in all of this, resilience is so much important, being able to sustain this, right? I think all the BCP plans that we had has gone out through the window, right? The BCP plans are out there. We never stress tested it to this point. And now we know that we can still survive and we can make it through this. So resilience has become important. And within that, if I look at it, being live is very important, that you're interconnected, that you're not suddenly struggling to figure out, where did this person go? So I think if you look at this as a paradigm, and what are your views, as you look into the future, as you look into the pharma industry's future, if you had, a crystal ball, if I may say, and your own predictions, where do you see this industry is going? What are some of your let's say 5 years out kind of a views, and both in terms of where pharma as an industry and medical devices as an industry will gravitate, and more importantly, how do you see technology in all of that evolve if you had to take, let's say, a long-term view?
Yeah. Yeah, look, I think our definition of long term has changed suddenly, Shubhru. Long term is no longer 5 years, but it's 5 months. But jokes aside, uh, look, I think there are some structural changes that we need to see happening in the overall healthcare ecosystem. Uh, it's way too complicated, and I think to be resilient, you've got to be simple. um, Complexity does not go well with resilience. So I think we'll have to think about as a society on what are some of these structural changes that we need to make in our ecosystem. I think it's got to start with aligning incentives of the different stakeholders. Perhaps the easiest way to is to start thinking about consumer centricity that we discussed. Um, and then let's not be afraid of technology. I think technology is going to be an enabler to this. I think it's a fantastic value creation lever. uh, and I think this whole narrative around man versus machine is just a false narrative. It's that is not the point of this. It's what the man and machine can go to together versus man versus machine. um, so I think I keep talking a lot about the mindset and the culture, and the fundamentals that we need to look at, because the rest of it can flow. We have enough um, technical knowledge and brilliant organizations, you guys included, who can solve for the nitty gritties and the technical challenges of those. But if we can look at creating an alignment within our ecosystem, doing some structural changes, being open to that, um, and not having this comparative discussion all the time, man versus machine, this versus that, but how can we integrate these things together. I think if we do that, then we'll be in a fundamentally different position than where we are. We'll be much more simpler to operate. We'll be much more resilient to operate. We will have a little more visibility and transparency, and at least trust uh, with each other. So I think that's where we think. I think there will be some companies which will do well, and there will be some companies that will not survive. So let's be honest about that as well. So that's at least where we think, for this pharma industry, it's in need for some structural changes, and that'll come only when some of our mindset sort of changes, and we look at the broader picture.
No, that's great insight, Saurav. Thank you for sharing this. And I agree, this on this happy note of man versus machine. And yes, it's not man versus machine. Maybe the new world is man with machine,
Yeah.
what we can do together. I agree with you. There will be a lot of structural changes needed. And yes, the 5 month is possibly the new paradigm of a long term, but the long term still remains long term, because in pharma, the changes will only happen in a long-term basis, because these are not easy, like structural changes, especially. So yes, I think there is a lot of hope, a lot of positive energy around the industry itself. I'm sure that they will come through on what we direly need is a vaccine, a treatment to come out of this particular crisis. So Saurav, thank you for sharing your wonderful insights on our perspectives session. And it's always good to have you on the show.
Hey, no, thanks, Shubhro. Thanks for having me. It's always great to debate and discuss with you some of the trends and share notes on the market.
So with that, we're going to sign off for today. I would like to thank all the audience and viewers who have joined us on this first ever session of LinkedIn Live from Infosys. We talked about being resilient, that's live enterprise, new opportunities and challenges in the pharma industry. Thank you, Saurav, once again for joining us. To the audience, goodbye, and please stay safe. Thank you now.